Hello there. Today I want to talk about the new king of easy mode mod builds, and that's Prismatic Driver. In my opinion, this thing has dethroned Anguish as the best option to get respectable DPS with almost no aim or skill, so let's get into it. So first, let's compare Prismatic Driver to Anguish. On the DPS front, Prismatic Driver is going to come out on top until Low the Week's ramping damage bonus can fully kick in, but overall I'd say they're about equal on bosses. Where Prismatic Driver really comes out ahead is the convenience and greatly improved mobbing capabilities. Since Low the Week's needles have a set delay before they explode, you'll inevitably end up getting staggered by your own shots when enemies you've already shot run into you, since they're not actually going to die until the needles detonate. On the other hand, Prismatic Driver's explosion only goes off once 4 ticks of the beam have landed, so you're always in control of when the explosions are going to happen. The second important difference between Prismatic Driver and Anguish is that Prismatic Driver wants no investment into fire rate. In fact, you don't want to modify your fire rate at all, as any positive or negative change ends up affecting the rate of the explosions in a weird way that isn't fully understood right now. And so while this can be a downside, as you can't take the fire rate buff in Boss Rush to get a crazy DPS increase like you can on Anguish, it also means that we aren't losing out on huge amounts of damage by not building for fire rate. So if you think of it this way, if Prismatic Driver can rival Anguish in terms of damage without needing to build fire rate at all, then you just effectively have an Anguish build, but with more free slots open. Now, with that brief comparison out of the way, let's get into the builds. We're using mods that create explosions, so Archon Summoner is the single correct archetype choice. Nothing much to discuss there. Now, for the guns and the mods, we're obviously using Prismatic Driver, but for the secondary mod, I've chosen to stick with Nebula even after its huge nerf. Nanoswarm is still a great mod while it's active. It still seeks and destroys mobs on their own while applying a nice debuff to elites, aberrations, and bosses. What the nerf did was greatly decrease its uptime, which was definitely a big hit to a lot of builds that were just slapping on Nebula because it was so generically good. But on this setup, we're going to get near permanent uptime on the mod while also using the shorter duration to our advantage. And this is because our amulet of choice is Reaction Chain. This amulet is the single most broken item in the game, and I'm planning to make a more in-depth video covering the Reaction Chain family of builds. Yes, this one single item is so broken that it creates its entire own family of builds. But for the purposes of this build, it gives us a convenient way to instantly refill our Prismatic Driver charges. Casting Nanoswarm is going to refund 15 charges instantly, and with feedback on the Prismatic Driver gun, this is more than enough charges to shoot for Nanoswarm's 10-second duration. And since we're constantly spending mod charges because this is a beam mod, we're going to keep Archon's Tempest Prime perk and Power Creep perks permanently active to generate mod power for Nebula through its active mod. And combined with Feedback's mod damage to mod power generation, we're going to be able to recast Nanoswarm off cooldown. And even if you don't end up dealing damage with Prismatic Driver to refund energy with Feedback and recast Nebula as soon as it ends, just shooting a few more charges of Prismatic Driver is going to generate mod power via Reaction Chain, which is going to instantly refill Nebula. Now, for the rings, we're building crit because it's the best way to increase damage in this game. Shocker, I know. There are 2 main setups you can go for depending on whether you want more comfort and more flexible ring choices or just more damage. And which one you go for is going to depend on the legendary you have. So Power Fantasy is the maximum DPS option, and on your Power Fantasy Prism, you're going to want to go for Mod Crit, Sapper, Meta, and Mage, and then take whatever you want in the final slot. Just make sure you don't have any fire rate at all. Then if you build full crit like this, you'll end up at 95% crit chance with a 2.45 times crit damage multiplier on the Prismatic Driver explosion, which is where the vast majority of our damage is coming from. You really cannot afford to drop any of these rings without really substantially hurting your damage though, so if you want some more flexibility, I'm going to recommend going with the Wrecking Ball build instead. For the Wrecking Ball Prism, we're taking Sapper and Mage as always, and then of course you'll want to have crit damage as either the single fragment or part of the meta fusion. The last two slots are your choice. For the rings, we've still got Burden of the Gambler and Probability Chord slotted in for the crit damage boost, but since we no longer need to pump up our crit chance, the final two slots are pretty much open for whatever you want. I've opted for Encrypted Ring for permanent healing since we're constantly spending mod charges with Prismatic Driver. And in the other slot, I just tend to go with Ring of the Robust as a generically good defensive option. Of course, you can always just stuff more damage into these slots with something like Burden of the Destroyer, but the advantage of Wrecking Ball is having open slots that don't demand that you fill them with a damage item. Power Fantasy is where you should be looking if you want more damage. Now for the rest of the stuff, let's go over the mutators first. I already mentioned feedback on the Prismatic Driver gun, and you're always going to take this because it greatly extends how long you can use the beam. On Nebula, I highly recommend taking Spirit Healer on the Power Fantasy version, as you just can't spare a slot for the extra sustain via Encrypted Ring on that setup. On the Wrecking Ball version, you can take basically whatever mutator you want. And then melee does not matter at all for either build. On the Relic, Profane Heart really cannot be beat here, in my opinion, but you can take something else if you really want to. Finally, for the traits, we're grabbing Spirit and Insight to keep our mod power economy going. Kinship is also mandatory because the Prismatic Driver explosions are just going to nuke you otherwise. And then go into more bulk with Fortify, Vigor, and Bark Skin. Footwork is also very good here, since just like Anguish, we're always ADS shooting Prismatic Driver. And then the last points can go wherever you want. I have them into Resolute to get up off the ground faster if you accidentally proc an explosion too close to yourself. But you can go into something like Triage for extra healing from Encrypted Ring or Spirit Healer. You could also go into Amplitude if you're feeling kind of spicy, but personally I'm never going to be a fan of increasing the AoE on an explosion with a hard knockdown. That is about it though. The most recent patch really turned the meta on its head, and Prismatic Driver was definitely a big winner. So go take it for a spin, try to not blow up your teammates, and enjoy.